A desperate attempt to save a broken marriage leads Joe and Ivy Davis to the decaying Quiet Haven Hotel, a place as storm-ridden and volatile as their relationship. But what begins as one last chance for a reconciliation quickly descends into a waking nightmare. In Downfall, reality fractures, time twists, and Joe finds himself trapped in a surreal battle with the darkest parts of himself. As the line between truth and delusion blurs, we're left questioning what's real, what's remembered, and what's already lost. In this video, I'll cover the game's psychological themes, unreliable memory, emotional trauma, and the familiar nature of regret, and what they reveal about Joe, Ivy, and the fragile limits of the human mind. As always, this video will be full of spoilers, so keep that in mind. And if you enjoy this content, remember to like, comment, and subscribe for more. So, sit back, get cozy, and join me as we explore Downfall's psychological horror at midnight. The original Downfall was released in 2009 by Harvester Games, a small indie team led by Polish developer Rem Michalski, with music composed by his brother Michael. In 2012, they released The Cat Lady, which garnered enough success for Rem to return to Poland and pursue game development full-time. In 2016, Downfall Redux was released, a full remake of the original game that reimagines its story with stronger ties to The Cat Lady and the broader Devil Came Through Here trilogy. This is the version featured in my walkthrough and the one referenced throughout this analysis. The remake was generally well received. Praises were given to its unsettling soundtrack and immersive character interactions, especially the branching dialogue choices that affect both relationships and the game's ending. However, some criticisms mentioned its clunky controls, uneven voice acting, and a visual style that occasionally clashes between character art and backgrounds, though others argue this enhances the game's surreal nightmarish tone. At the time of the original Downfall's development, Michalski was working in a nursing home, and many conversations between Joe and Ivy are drawn from his experiences there. Even some of the game's environments were inspired by rooms in that facility. A longtime fan of Stephen King, Michalski has expressed his desire to become the Stephen King of video games, using the horror genre to explore mature, deeply personal themes through metaphor and psychological storytelling. His passion for classic adventure games also shaped Downfall's design, built on traditional puzzle solving, branching dialogue, and inventory mechanics. For an indie horror title, Downfall has had an enduring impact. Nearly a decade since the remake and over 15 years since its original release at the time of recording this video. And with that, let's get into the game itself. I'll provide a summary of the game just in case you've either never heard of it or would like a refresher, but feel free to skip to this section if you just want the analysis. Downfall begins not in a hotel, but in memory, one soaked in blood and buried guilt. A young Joe Davis watches his younger brother Robbie chase a rumor: drug money hidden at a construction site. Before tragedy strikes, Joe meets Ivy, a guarded girl waiting outside a diner, claiming she's on a diet. They share a fleeting, innocent connection until Joe tries to impress her with free ice cream, and she leaves upset. Joe follows her, apologizing, only to be dragged back into Robbie's obsessive search. When they finally lift the slab, there is no cash, only grenades. Robbie grabs one. A moment later, he's gone, blown apart in front of Ivy and Joe. Years pass. Joe and Ivy reconnect, fall in love, and marry. But time carves deep wounds. Ivy battles body image issues and an eating disorder. Joe struggles with emotional distance. The love they once shared is rotting beneath the surface. Desperate to fix what's broken, Joe brings Ivy to the Quiet Haven Hotel for one final attempt to save their marriage. But something is wrong with the place. From the moment they arrive, the air is heavy, the walls decay, and Ivy gives him only silence. Ivy then starts to unravel, muttering about monsters and lashing out violently. Joe tries to ignore the signs, checking in with the cryptic manageress. On their floor, he finds a strange empty room, a giant mirror, and ominous silence. That night, Ivy tells Joe it's over, that he'd be better without her. Joe dreams of death, wandering their apartment's basement, retrieving a cat clock, and being murdered by a hulking axeman. He wakes alone. Ivy is gone. Joe descends into the hotel's dining room where dead anthropomorphic animals sit around tables. The manageress offers a name, Sophie, another guest, who may know where Ivy went. But the key to Sophie's room is swallowed by a black cat. Chasing the cat leads Joe through shifting realities until he finds himself back in the basement of his apartment. There he places the dream's cat clock into the furnace and the Axeman returns, but does not kill him. Instead, Joe retrieves the room key and finds himself suddenly back in the hotel. Sophie's room is disturbing. Cracked mirrors, a young girl in a mask trembling in a chair. She speaks of monsters and mirrors, of bad whispers, and asks Joe to help her to kill 4 memories of herself. She insists he start with her. Joe eventually poisons her and her body explodes. All that's left behind is a wedding dress and a single crack in the massive mirror from earlier, and thus the descent deepens. Joe delivers a brain to a surgeon named Dr. Z, who implants it into a lifeless woman. Joe flips the electric chair switch. She rises, naked, demanding something to wear. He gives her the wedding dress. Her name is Agnes. They're about to leave just as the Axeman storms in and knocks them out. Then the game splits. You play as either Agnes or Joe. Agnes awakens trapped in a room. She escapes out the window into a nearby building and finds Ivy, who directs her to escape. Through a bloody door, Agnes meets the Queen of Maggots, an otherworldly figure tying the game to the larger trilogy that includes the Cat Lady and Lorelei. Meanwhile, Joe wakes in a coffin, taunted by voices, a gun beside him, urged to take his own life. But Agnes pries open the coffin and they escape together. They end up in a dreamlike field, at the house Joe and Ivy once fantasized about. Inside, another Sophie, another memory to destroy, but not yet. Back in the hotel, they crash a grotesque birthday party held for a painfully thin Sophie. She sobs about being too fat, too unlovable for a man named Harrison. Joe later tricks Harrison into a gas-filled bathroom, killing both him and Bathroom Sophie in an explosion. Another crack appears in the mirror. Behind the carnage, they find a recipe for a slimming smoothie. Feeding it to thin Sophie kills her too, and the mirror cracks again. On the 4th floor, the manageress tells Joe she can help, but he must follow her trail, which winds through discarded clothing and into a cold, dark kitchen freezer. Inside, a hidden hallway. The door slams behind Joe, separating him from Agnes. She walks alone, haunted by reflections of Ivy in the mirrors. Then the Axeman appears, only to unmask himself. It's Joe. Inside the hidden room, Joe meets the manageress, naked and seductive on the bed, with a bloody axe at her side. She commands him to murder one final victim, Agnes. The player chooses whether to obey, but after the choice, Joe then turns the axe on the manageress. In a frenzy, he runs back to the field house. No final Sophie. He breaks through a door and emerges once again in his apartment. In a brief interlude, Susan Ashworth, the protagonist from The Cat Lady, hears strange sounds while in her own apartment and investigates. Joe, meanwhile, finds the final Sophie in the basement and kills her, shattering the mirror into the shape of a person. Inside the mirror, Ivy is dead, but Joe won't accept it. Determined to bring her back, he returns to Dr. Z's lab and attempts to resurrect her using the same electric chair. At the same time, Susan navigates the ruins of Joe's apartment and discovers the gateway to Quiet Haven in the basement. Before she arrives, Joe realizes the electricity doesn't bring Ivy back. As he collapses, haunted by hallucinations of other characters in the game, including the Queen of Maggots, Joe eventually sees Agnes, who willingly sits on the electric chair hoping to bring Ivy back. Just then, Susan finds Joe hovering over Ivy and knocks him unconscious. Then, the game decides how the story ends. A hidden morality system determines Joe's fate. The game secretly tracks every response, every act of cruelty or compassion, represented as invisible skulls. If Joe retains all 27, he and Ivy escape together. If all skulls are lost, both die in the fire. Anything in the middle triggers the normal ending. Joe carries Ivy out, but their fate remains unclear. The ending plays as a newspaper article, recounting the apartment fire, sometimes a tragedy, sometimes a mystery. But the truth behind it all, the hotel, the monsters, the mirror, may never be fully known. Now that you're all caught up, let's head into the analysis. As a reminder, I am not a psychologist or qualified to diagnose mental health conditions. Everything stated in this video is my own personal opinion. If you've never dipped your toes into the Devil Came Through Here trilogy, there are two important things you should know before we even think about diving into Downfall. First, this is a world where the supernatural is absolutely unquestionably real. Across all three games, there's one constant, the Queen of Maggots. She's this strange, almost otherworldly presence who shows up to directly interact with the protagonists, often by bending or outright reshaping reality around them. How much she's actually influencing events depends on the game. In Downfall, her presence is pretty minimal compared to the others, but more on that later. Second, Rem Michalski, the series' creator, doesn't just dabble in horror for cheap thrills. Each entry in the trilogy is built around exploring a very specific set of psychological themes. In an interview with The Escapist, he flat out says, "In Downfall, I explore eating disorders and schizophrenia." That's worth sitting with for a second, because when you've got two main characters, Joe and Ivy Davis, it's not a stretch to connect the dots. If Ivy's battle is with an eating disorder, then maybe Joe's struggle is with schizophrenia. And if that's true, then everything we see through Joe's eyes suddenly becomes a lot less trustworthy. The strange environments, the surreal encounters, maybe they're not so much supernatural as they are the hallucinations and delusions of a fractured mind. Sure, there are moments, especially near the end, where we get flickers of what might be objective reality, but that's not what keeps me coming back to Downfall. Because for me, the real hook isn't the mystery of what's real or imagined. It's the emotional heart of the story. And here's the thing, I don't think that heart belongs to Joe Davis. Now, if you've seen some of my past breakdowns, you know I'll often save the protagonist for last, usually because they're the one driving the story forward. But Downfall is different. Sure, Joe's the guy you control, the one making the choices, but the real weight of this story isn't about a man on a quest. It's about the suffering of someone he loves, and what happens when the person trying to save you is drowning themselves. So, what do we actually know about Joe? The game's prologue paints most of the picture. He meets Ivy as a kid, just before witnessing his little brother Robbie's death, a trauma that ripples into adulthood. Towards the end of the game, we see him hallucinate a conversation with his father, who blames him for Robbie's death and his mother's eventual suicide. He reconnects with Ivy years later, they marry, move into the Helen Road apartments, and eventually their relationship fractures. He seems to live in isolation, no friends, no real community, just him and Ivy. And his stated goal in Downfall? Save Ivy at all costs. Except, the deeper you dig, the more it feels like that's not what's really happening at all. One interesting thing worth pointing out is how Downfall uses player choice. As Joe, we're often given multiple dialogue options for how he speaks to Ivy. On the surface, that makes it feel like we are shaping his personality, choosing whether he's tender, dismissive, or outright cruel. But here's the thing, the other options still exist. They're still Joe's potential thoughts. Just because we picked the nicer response doesn't erase the fact that his mind went to the darker one. If you don't believe me, it's the same trick the cat lady used when Dr. X asks Susan about her past. No matter what you pick, the outcome is the same, her refusal to answer. The choices reveal not just what a character does, but what they're capable of. And with Joe, that capability leans heavily into anger, bitterness, and control. So even when we, the player, steer him toward restraint, the game reminds us that his harsher impulses are always simmering under the surface. Michalski said Downfall tackles eating disorders and schizophrenia. And if Ivy's struggle is with the former, then all signs point to Joe wrestling with the latter. The World Health Organization's definition is pretty broad: hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thought, and a lot of Joe's actions and interactions start making sense under that lens. And the kicker? We actually get another perspective on him in The Cat Lady. There, Susan stumbles into Joe's apartment, which seems to warp into echoes of the Quiet Haven Hotel from Downfall. Mirrors, mannequins, cryptic behavior, and a chillingly casual shift from violent outbursts to eerie calm. Joe talks as if Ivy's alive and just not herself, while Susan finds something monstrous in her place. And yet, when reality snaps back, Mitzi insists only a minute passed. That moment is a Rosetta Stone for Downfall. It suggests Joe's hotel journey may not have been a journey at all. The hotel could just be the rooms of Helen Road apartments, refracted through his fractured perception. And when Joe says he's trying to save Ivy, it's not from some supernatural menace, it's from the monsters of her own eating disorder. Various scenes reveal Ivy engaging in self-induced vomiting, chained furniture, locked bathrooms. All the signs point to Joe forcing his own solution on her. It's dark, it's controlling, and it's deadly. By the end, it feels like the entire game is taking place after Ivy's death, Joe's desperate, deluded attempt to rescue a woman who's already gone. From there, everything in Downfall starts to look like a manifestation. Dr. Z, as his therapist, twisted into a threatening figure. The manageress as an embodiment of idealized femininity that Joe has to overcome. And Agnes, oh, Agnes. She's not just another character. She's the fragment of Ivy Joe fell in love with. The bright, loving part that existed before everything went to hell. By splitting Ivy into separate identities, Joe preserves the good parts of her: warmth, innocence, and the connection they once shared, while distancing himself from the pain, resentment, and reality of their failing marriage. Agnes becomes the untainted fantasy, the version of Ivy untouched by years of strain, guilt, and bitterness. This fragmentation allows Joe to love Agnes without confronting the uncomfortable truth about Ivy, or his role in her suffering. In doing so, he's not just interacting with his wife's idealized self, he's clinging to a memory, a self-deceptive construct that lets him avoid facing the person she has truly become. And this is where we eventually see the Queen of Maggots confronting Joe. Towards the end, she condemns Joe for his actions and calls him the sixth parasite, which, if you don't already know from The Cat Lady, labels him as an antagonist of the story. Yet he does not acknowledge what he's done. It's denial made flesh. And all of that, that's still just Joe's side of the story, because the real heart of Downfall isn't him, it's Ivy. We first meet Ivy as a child in the prologue, sitting outside a diner while her mother eats inside. When Joe approaches her, she refuses to join him for ice cream because she's on a diet. It's a brief moment, but it's devastating. From an incredibly young age, Ivy has already internalized distorted ideas about food, weight, and beauty. Whether that came from family dynamics, cultural pressure, or her own fragile self-image, we're never told, but that seed is there, and it grows. By adulthood, her struggle is undeniable. She admits to Joe that she induces vomiting, sees herself as fat, and aspires to be the women she sees in the media. These are hallmarks of a serious eating disorder. The game externalizes her suffering through these Sophies, each representing a dimension of her torment. That first Sophie embodies depression and suicidal ideation. The thin Sophie at the birthday party reflects societal pressure and judgment about beauty standards. And the last two Sophies, in the bathroom and in the basement, are Ivy's warped self-image. Grotesque, monstrous, a nightmarish reflection of how she sees herself. This is consistent with either anorexia nervosa, the restricting subtype, bulimia nervosa, or possibly ednos, or eating disorder not otherwise specified, given the combination of restrictive behavior and purging. Regardless of exact classification, Ivy's struggle has been ongoing for years. And here's what makes her character even more tragic. She told Joe. Despite stigma, shame, and fear of judgment, Ivy actually opened up. That takes an immense amount of trust and self-awareness. But instead of compassion, Joe answered with control, locking the bathroom so she couldn't purge and force-feeding her. A chance for intimacy and support curdled into betrayal. Meanwhile, Joe's fractured mind twisted all of this into his grotesque, quiet haven fantasy. Where Ivy's pain manifested as Sophie's, Joe conjured Agnes. His denial, his fantasy of an untouched Ivy he could love without guilt. But neither the Sophies nor Agnes are the real Ivy. They're distortions, created because Joe couldn't accept her as she was. And that's why Ivy, not Joe, is the emotional core of Downfall. The true horror isn't supernatural. It's Ivy's lived pain, the eating disorder that consumed her, the stigma that kept her silent, the courage it took to speak, and the betrayal that followed. Joe ultimately neglected therapy, which we see in the cat lady. Ivy didn't appear to receive treatment. Instead, she was buried under the weight of his delusions. Joe's downfall gives the game its title, but Ivy's tragedy is what gives it its soul. So, where do we go from here? After all the darkness, confusion, and suffering in Downfall, is there any hope for people like Joe and Ivy? First, let's be clear. I'm not here to excuse Joe. He shows symptoms consistent with schizophrenia, but he also caused immense harm, including Ivy's death. A diagnosis doesn't erase accountability. At the same time, schizophrenia is complex. Symptoms vary widely, and just because Joe behaves a certain way doesn't mean everyone with this condition will. Demonizing people with mental illness is both unfair and inaccurate. The same goes for Ivy. Eating disorders can look very different from person to person. Understanding her struggle means seeing her as an individual, not just a label or someone you can just easily fix. But there is hope. Organizations like the National Alliance on Mental Illness provide resources for treatment and support. For people living with schizophrenia or similar conditions, maintaining a healthy lifestyle, managing stress, building supportive relationships, and seeking professional help through therapy, medication, or other treatments can make a real difference. Supporting someone with schizophrenia often means being patient, noticing triggers, offering encouragement for therapy or medication, and creating a calm, stable presence. For eating disorders, treatment can include therapy, like cognitive behavioral therapy, nutritional guidance, and emotional support. Helping someone struggling means being a safe, non-judgmental presence and encouraging professional care. Recovery comes from understanding, patience, and support from trained professionals. Downfall is a stark reminder of what can happen when mental illness goes untreated, and when attempts to help are misguided or controlling. It shows the real dangers, but also the real need for sympathy, understanding, and proper care. No one should have to face this alone. Organizations like NAMI provide a lifeline with guidance, resources, and support for both individuals struggling and the loved ones who want to help. If you or someone you know is struggling or would like to learn more information, check out the following resources, which are also referenced in the description. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. If there's anything you feel I've missed from a psychological analysis perspective, have a different view about any of the characters, or would like to see me explore a particular character in detail in another video, please let me know in the comments below. I'm interested to hear your take on the subject. I'm also open to hear any suggestions you have for next games I should cover. Otherwise, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you in the next game.